That day, justice wasn't wearing a black robe, it wore the heart of a mother. There are moments in life when the air feels too heavy to breathe, when the world you built with your bare hands begins to crumble, and the only thing left standing is the promise you once made to your child, "I'll protect you, no matter what." That promise was the reason I found myself walking through the courthouse doors that gray Chicago morning. The marble floors were polished to a mirror shine, reflecting faces of strangers who didn't know my name or the storm that had brought me there. I was 50 years old, a widow, a woman who had buried both love and pride. And yet that day I was not just Evelyn Walker, the quiet mother who lived on the south side of the city. I was something else entirely, something I had promised myself I'd never have to become again. My son, Marcus, sat at the plaintiff's table, shoulders hunched, a cane resting against his chair. The light from the tall courthouse windows fell across his face, revealing the exhaustion that no young man should ever have to wear. The accident had taken more than the strength from his legs. It had stripped him of the confidence that once filled every corner of his laughter. And beside him, sitting like victory wrapped in perfume and designer fabric, was Vanessa, his wife. Her blonde hair was pulled back into a perfect twist, the kind you only see in magazines and divorce hearings. Her eyes didn't touch Marcus. They were fixed straight ahead at the man who would decide their fate. Judge Richard Cole. When the bailiff called the room to order, Judge Cole entered, his expression a practiced blend of authority and exhaustion. He had seen it all, the lies, the tears, the crumbling vows of once happy couples. But when his eyes moved past Marcus and landed on me, the gavel froze in his hand. He blinked once, then twice. His voice dropped almost to a whisper. "Mrs. Walker," he said. A silence spread across the courtroom like smoke. "Why are you here?" For a moment, the only sound was the faint hum of the ceiling fans. Even Vanessa turned, her face shifting from confidence to confusion. She didn't know what the judge knew, that 20 years ago I had stood where she sat now. That back then, I wasn't just a mother or a widow. I was Evelyn Walker, the lioness of law, one of the few black women to ever lead a federal case in Illinois, a name whispered with equal parts respect and fear in every downtown courtroom. But that was a lifetime ago, before I traded courtrooms for kitchens, before the death of my husband tore a hole in my spirit so deep that I promised myself never to set foot in a courthouse again. Until today. I met the judge's stare, steady and unflinching. "I'm here," I said quietly, "for my son." You could almost hear the air shift. Even the court reporter lifted her head, sensing that this was no ordinary hearing. Marcus had been quiet since the accident. My once loud, laughing boy now spoke in whispers, as if afraid his voice might offend the world. When Vanessa filed for divorce and demanded half the house Marcus built with years of overtime and sweat, he didn't argue. He simply said, "Maybe it's for the best, Mom." But it wasn't. It was betrayal dressed in legality. Vanessa's family, wealthy, impatient, and full of subtle disdain, sat behind her like a row of expensive vultures. They looked at me with the same expression I'd seen too often in this city, pity mixed with superiority. The black mother from the wrong side of town. The charity case who had somehow entered their perfect world. If only they knew. I adjusted my coat, a simple gray one I'd owned for years, and placed my old leather briefcase on the table beside Marcus. The sound of it hitting the wood thud was sharp enough to make Vanessa flinch. It was the same briefcase I had carried through every trial of my career. Inside, among yellow documents and ink stains, was the one thing she didn't expect me to have: truth. The judge cleared his throat. "Mrs. Walker," he said again, his voice now steadier but tinged with something that sounded like reverence. "Are you representing your son?" Vanessa's lawyer, a young woman in a navy suit, all nerves and arrogance, scoffed. "Your Honor, Mrs. Walker isn't on the bar anymore. This is a family case, not a crusade." I smiled politely. I'm not here to argue law, counselor. I'm here to remind this court that behind every file number there are people, and one of them happens to be my son. The young lawyer's smirk faded. Judge Cole leaned back, studying me as though seeing the ghost of his own past. I suppose, he said softly, justice runs in the family. While they began to read the petitions, I let my eyes rest on Marcus. His hands trembled slightly as he held his papers. I wanted to reach out, to remind him that no courtroom, no verdict could measure the worth of a man's soul. But I also knew something he didn't, that Vanessa wasn't here for closure. She was here for conquest. She wanted the house, the money, the symbolic victory of walking away untouched while leaving us in ruins. I had seen her kind before: charm as strategy, innocence as weapon. She didn't expect resistance, especially not from me. When she glanced my way, she offered a faint, practiced smile, the kind women use when they've already decided you're irrelevant. I didn't return it. My silence was enough. The proceedings began. Legal terms filled the air like foreign hymns: petition for division of assets, spousal maintenance, custody review. But beneath all the jargon, the war was simple. She wanted what wasn't hers, and I wouldn't let her take it. At one point, Vanessa's lawyer spoke about Marcus as if he weren't even in the room. "Your Honor," she said, "my client's husband is physically incapacitated. He cannot provide, cannot fulfill his duties. Mrs. Walker has been forced into a life of hardship through no fault of her own." My son's knuckles turned white around his cane. I placed my hand on his arm. "Breathe," I whispered. The lawyer continued, each word slicing through the air like a blade. "He has become a burden," she said. That word, burden, cracked something inside me. I stood before the judge even before he could stop me. "Your Honor," I said, my voice steady but fierce, "my son is not a burden. He's a man who worked 12-hour days to build a home from nothing. A man who risked his life to give his wife comfort. If this courtroom is looking for someone who knows hardship, look at me, because I've lived it." The young lawyer tried to object, but Judge Cole raised a hand. "Let her speak," he said. Vanessa's eyes flickered, confusion turning into fear. It was the first time I saw her unsure of herself. The rest of the hearing blurred into a haze of statements and objections, but I remember the moment it ended. The judge's gavel struck once, echoing through the chamber. "We'll reconvene next week," he said. People stood, whispered, left. But as I gathered my papers, Judge Cole spoke softly across the bench, just loud enough for me to hear. "Mrs. Walker," he said, "it's good to see that you're still fighting for what's right." I looked up at him, this man who once, years ago, had watched me defend the voiceless. "I'm not fighting for law, Judge," I replied. "I'm fighting for love." As I walked out of that courtroom, the whispers followed about who I was, where I'd been, what I might do next. But I didn't care. Because for the first time in years, I felt the old fire again. And somewhere deep inside me, I knew this was only the beginning. Some battles aren't fought in war rooms or streets. They're fought in courtrooms and in the quiet hearts of mothers who refuse to give up. When I got home that evening, the weight of the courtroom still sat on my shoulders like a winter coat I couldn't take off. The silence of our small kitchen was thicker than the fog outside. The ticking clock on the wall, the one Marcus had fixed years ago, sounded louder than it should have. Every tick felt like a reminder of all the years that had slipped away while I was busy trying to hold our lives together. Marcus sat by the window, his crutches leaning against the table, his eyes lost somewhere between shame and exhaustion. "Mom," he said quietly, "you didn't have to do that today." I smiled faintly. "Do what?" "Show up, fight for me. You shouldn't have to go through this again." I poured 2 cups of tea, slid one across the table. The steam curled like ghosts in the air. "I'm your mother," I said. "It's my job to go through things for you." He didn't look up. His hands were trembling again. The accident had done that, not just to his body, but to his confidence. Ever since that day at the construction site, When the scaffolding gave way and the steel beam caught his leg, he hadn't been the same. The house we sat in, our home, was the proof of all his labor before the fall. Every corner had a story. The chipped kitchen counter he'd installed himself. The back porch where he'd promised Vanessa they'd raise their children. The handprints in the cement by the garage, one big, one small, ours. It wasn't a mansion, but it was ours, built not with wealth but with sacrifice. I remember the first day we found it. Marcus was 23 then, full of dreams and drive. He just landed a steady job in a construction firm, and I was still working as a clerk in a tax office downtown. Money was tight, but hope was high. The real estate agent, a cheerful woman in a pink blazer, had looked at us skeptically when we told her our budget. "In this neighborhood?" she asked, almost laughing. "You'll need a miracle." And a miracle came in the form of Thomas Reed. Thomas was a man in his 60s, a business magnate who had made his fortune building half the skyline of Chicago. But the first time I met him, years before, he wasn't a giant of industry. He was just a man stranded on a roadside with a flat tire. I had stopped my old Toyota that morning because something about him, the desperation in his eyes, maybe, reminded me of my husband, Samuel, before the cancer took him. I helped him fix his tire in the freezing cold. Didn't ask for a dime. He'd laughed, said, "You must be the last kind person left in this city." We stayed in touch after that, not romantically, though people liked to whisper otherwise. He admired my perseverance, I respected his decency. He used to say, "You remind me of what Chicago used to be, honest, tired, but still standing." So, when Marcus and I couldn't afford the down payment on the little brick house by Maple Avenue, Thomas quietly stepped in. He didn't give us money outright, he loaned it on paper, but never asked for it back. "Think of it as an investment in goodness," he said. "The world could use more of that." For a time, life almost felt normal. Marcus worked long hours, Vanessa, then just his girlfriend, would visit every evening, bringing laughter and the smell of vanilla perfume into the house. She was charming, clever, ambitious. I saw the way Marcus looked at her, the way his entire face softened when she walked into the room. One night, as we sat out on the porch under a warm summer sky, he said, "Mom, I'm going to marry her." I smiled, though something in me hesitated. "You sure, baby?" He nodded, eyes glowing. "She believes in me. She makes me feel like I can build anything." I wanted to believe it too. After all the years of hardship, who was I to question happiness? The wedding was small but beautiful. I remember the way Vanessa looked in her lace gown, flawless, like she belonged in a magazine. Her parents, dressed in designer suits, shook my hand politely, their smiles stiff as starched collars. "We're so glad Marcus is part of the family," her mother said. Her eyes said something else. "We'll see how long that lasts." Still, that day I refused to see anything but joy. For the first time in decades, laughter filled our home. The house came alive with clinking glasses, gospel music, and dancing feet. I stood in the doorway watching my son spin his new bride, thinking that maybe, finally, we were free of struggle. But life has a way of hiding storms behind sunsets. The first cracks came quietly. A late bill here, a tense silence there. Marcus's job became more demanding. Vanessa complained about the neighborhood, the small kitchen, the noise from the train tracks nearby. "This isn't the life I imagined," she'd mutter when she thought I wasn't listening. I wanted to tell her that life rarely matches what we imagine, that love is more about endurance than excitement, but I stayed silent. You can't teach patience to someone who's never had to wait for anything. Then came the accident, a rainy Thursday in November. Marcus was working on a high-rise downtown when a cable snapped. I still remember the sound of the phone ringing, that hollow ring that splits time in two, before and after. He survived by some mercy, but the damage to his leg was permanent. And with it, the life he knew was gone. Vanessa changed almost overnight. The woman who once kissed his scars now flinched when she looked at his crutches. She started spending nights at her sister's place, then weekends visiting friends. When she was home, her laughter turned sharp, her eyes colder. I tried to keep the peace, cooked her favorite meals, filled the silence with small talk, but every word felt like walking barefoot on glass. One evening, I found her standing by the living room window, staring out at the rain. "Do you ever regret marrying him?" I asked softly. She turned, startled, then smiled, a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Regret's a useless word, Mrs. Walker. We all make choices." Then she walked away. That night after she left, Marcus broke down for the first time. "She doesn't love me anymore," he said. His voice cracked like a boy's. I held him the same way I had when he was 10 and scraped his knees, whispering the same promise I'd made all his life. "You'll be okay, baby. I've got you." But deep down, I knew something had shifted, not just in Vanessa, but in him, in us. The walls of this house, once filled with warmth, began to feel colder. Still, I couldn't give up. This home, this family, it was built from too much struggle to fall apart so easily. I thought if I held it together long enough, maybe the cracks would seal themselves. Maybe love could find its way back. I didn't know then that the foundation was already crumbling, not from neglect or time, but from betrayal. And that soon, the same house we built with love would become the battlefield where truth and lies would finally collide. After the accident, our lives slowed to a crawl. Days bled into each other like rain streaking down a window. Marcus spent most of his time in the downstairs room, the one we once planned to turn into a nursery, while I tried to keep the house running on hope and caffeine. Bills arrived like clockwork, thick white envelopes that carried more fear than ink. Disability checks came late, and the hospital kept calling. I sold my jewelry, canceled every little luxury, the cable TV, the Friday dinners at Lou's Diner, even my church tithe. What I didn't sell was my pride. It was a quiet morning in early February when I found a letter tucked under my door. Cream-colored paper, handwriting too elegant to belong to a bill collector. "Evelyn," I heard about Marcus. "Please let me help. T.R." I stared at the initials for a long time before I could breathe. Thomas Reed. It had been nearly 5 years since I last saw him, since he retired to Florida, trading the city's chaos for ocean calm. I'd sent him Christmas cards, he'd sent back silence. I figured that was his way of saying goodbye without saying it. But now, here he was again, like some echo from the past refusing to fade. That afternoon, I called the number written below his signature. The line rang twice before a deep, familiar voice answered. "Evelyn Walker," he said, warmth dripping from the words. I wondered how long it'd take you to call. "I wasn't sure you meant it," I admitted. He chuckled softly. "I never say what I don't mean." We met at a small cafe downtown, the kind that smelled like roasted beans and old secrets. Thomas looked older, his silver hair thinner, his tan deeper. But his eyes, those calm, discerning eyes, hadn't changed at all. "You look tired," he said, studying me over his cup. "I am," I confessed, "but tired isn't new to me." He nodded, understanding. "I remember, you always carried the weight of 2 lives and still made it look graceful." For a while, we didn't speak. Just sat there, 2 people bound by years of unspoken respect. Then he leaned forward, lowering his voice. "I've kept up with your son's company. That construction firm didn't treat him right. No safety nets, no coverage worth a damn." I sighed. "We signed what we could afford. I thought hard work would keep him safe." Thomas shook his head. "In this city, hard work only makes you a better target." There was bitterness in his tone, the kind of truth you only learn after building empires and watching them rot. He reached into his briefcase and slid an envelope across the table. "Don't," I said immediately, pushing it back. "You've done enough." "This isn't charity, Evelyn," he replied firmly. "It's repayment, for reminding me once that goodness isn't extinct." I hesitated. He smiled. You fixed my tire that day, remember? You could have driven right past me, but you stopped. I never forgot that. I took the envelope, fingers trembling. Inside was a check enough to pay off Marcus's medical bills and maybe breathe again. My throat tightened. I can't accept this. You can, he said, his eyes soft. And you will, because this isn't about money, it's about dignity. You've spent your whole life helping others. Let someone help you for once. Something broke inside me then, not from sadness, but relief. The kind that comes when someone sees the weight you've been carrying and offers to lift it without judgment. We talked for hours that day. About the city, about his late wife, about Marcus's future. Before we left, he placed his hand over mine. "Promise me something," he said. "If you ever find yourself drowning, don't go down quietly. You were born to fight." Weeks turned into months. With Thomas's help, I was able to stabilize things. He connected Marcus with a new physical therapist, paid off some hospital debt anonymously, and even sent fresh groceries every Friday through a service that refused to take my money. "Tell him to stop spoiling us," Marcus would say, rolling his eyes but smiling for the first time in months. "He's just being kind," I'd reply. "People aren't kind for free, Mom." Maybe he was right, but Thomas's kindness never came with conditions, just an occasional phone call asking if we were holding up. He became something like family. He dropped by once a month, bringing lilies for the kitchen and a bottle of lemonade he claimed reminded him of the South. He'd sit with Marcus on the porch, talking about football, the markets, the weather, things men talked about when they didn't want to talk about pain. Sometimes, I caught Vanessa watching them from the window, her expression unreadable. She never liked Thomas, said he was too involved, that he made Marcus feel smaller. But what she really hated was the light in Marcus's eyes whenever Thomas came around. That spark of purpose she couldn't control. One afternoon, as Thomas was leaving, Vanessa stopped him at the door. "Mr. Reed," she said sweetly, her hand brushing the frame. "It's so generous of you to help, but don't you think you've done enough?" Thomas smiled politely. "Generosity isn't measured in enough, Mrs. Walker. It's measured in love." Her smile faltered just for a second, then she turned away. I should have seen it then, the jealousy blooming behind her grin, the way she began to see kindness as a threat. It was a quiet Sunday morning when Thomas called me again. His voice was softer this time, slower. "Evelyn, I'm sick," he said simply. "Doctors found something in my lungs." The world stilled. "I'll be fine," he added quickly. "Just a matter of time, though. I wanted you to know I've arranged something for Marcus, for you both." He didn't explain, and I didn't ask. Some things between us were understood in silence. A few weeks later, I got a letter from his attorney. Thomas had passed away in his sleep. Inside the envelope was a deed to the very house we lived in, transferred completely to Marcus Walker, in gratitude for the family that reminded me what home truly means. I cried that night like I hadn't cried in years. Not because of grief alone, but because someone, somewhere, had believed in our worth enough to write it into law. Vanessa didn't cry. She stood by the doorway, arms folded. "So he just gave us the house," she said, disbelief sharp in her tone. "Yes," I said quietly, "because he believed in Marcus." Her lips curled, "Or in you." It was the first time she said it out loud, the venom that had been building for months. I didn't reply. There are battles not worth words. But I saw it then, the flicker of something cold in her eyes, a hunger, a calculation. That night, I prayed in the dark, my hands clasped over the old Bible I'd had since my wedding day. "Lord," I whispered, "you sent us a blessing through Thomas. Please don't let it turn into a curse." I didn't know it yet, but the curse had already begun, one whispered conversation, one hidden betrayal, one lie at a time. And before long, the man who believed in me would become the ghost whose gift tore my family apart. Grief is a strange thing. It doesn't always arrive in tears or silence. Sometimes it comes dressed as change. After Thomas's passing, our home felt heavier. The air itself seemed to carry his absence, like dust that refused to settle. Marcus grieved quietly, his sadness tucked behind small smiles and longer hours in his workshop. But Vanessa, she changed in ways I couldn't name at first. She started wearing brighter clothes, more perfume, a new shade of lipstick that left marks on wine glasses. She'd come home late, sometimes not at all, always with an excuse that sounded too rehearsed to be true. "Just work," she'd say, dropping her handbag on the couch. "You know how stressful these charity events can be." I wanted to believe her, but there was something hollow in her tone, an echo of the woman she used to be. One night, as I folded laundry, I found a card tucked inside her coat pocket. The Metropolitan Grand Hotel. A receipt. 1 room, 2 guests. I froze, staring at the printed letters until they blurred. I told myself there must be an explanation, a mistake, a business meeting, anything but what my heart already knew. I didn't tell Marcus, not yet. I couldn't bring myself to crush what was left of his hope. Spring came to Chicago in shy bursts of color. The trees along Maple Avenue bloomed early, but inside our house, nothing grew. We ate dinners in silence. Even little Lily, my granddaughter, seemed to sense the shift. She stopped asking when her mother would tuck her in. She stopped drawing family portraits with all 3 of them together. One evening, while I helped Lily with her homework, Vanessa stood by the kitchen counter, scrolling through her phone. Her reflection in the window caught my eye. She wasn't reading, she was smiling. That soft, secret smile that belongs only to lovers or liars. "Vanessa," I said gently, "how's work?" She looked up, startled. "Busy, always busy. Do you like what you do?" She shrugged, pouring herself another glass of wine. "What I like doesn't matter. What matters is what I deserve." Her words lingered in the air, bitter and sharp, what she deserved. I wanted to ask, "And what about what you've already been given?" But I didn't. There are moments when silence speaks louder than sermons. By summer, she was gone more often than she was home. When Marcus asked, she snapped, "Do you want me to stay here all day and rot like you?" The cruelty in her voice made me flinch, even though the words weren't aimed at me. That night, I heard Marcus crying in his room. I stood outside his door, hand hovering over the knob, but I couldn't open it. Sometimes a mother's love isn't enough to fix what the world breaks. In the mornings, I'd find Vanessa's perfume lingering in the hallway, proof of her presence and her absence all at once. The house that Thomas had given us, that Marcus had built with his own hands, began to feel less like a home and more like a battlefield. Every word, every look carried the tension of a ticking bomb. It was around that time I started noticing new things: expensive handbags, jewelry that didn't come from Marcus, and whispers on the phone she'd end the moment I walked into the room. One afternoon, I overheard her talking in the living room, voice low but urgent. "Yes, I told him the property was joint," she said. "The old woman doesn't know anything about law. Once we split it, we'll sell fast." I froze behind the door, my pulse roaring in my ears. She laughed then, a sound that didn't belong to the girl I once called my daughter. "He'll never see it coming," she said. That was the moment love turned into war. The next morning, I went to the drawer where I kept all our important papers, deeds, insurance forms, Thomas's letters. They were all there, untouched, but the weight of them felt different. For years, those papers had represented safety. Now they were evidence of trust, of betrayal, of everything in between. I looked at the house deed again. The name on it was clear: Marcus Walker. Purchased before marriage. The law was on our side, but I knew how people like Vanessa operated. It wasn't just about winning, it was about taking everything, even your peace. That evening, I confronted her. The sky outside was bruised purple with storm clouds. "I found the hotel receipt," I said quietly, "and I heard your call." Her face stayed perfectly still. "You shouldn't be listening to my calls." "I shouldn't have to," I said. "You're planning to take this house, aren't you?" She laughed, a soft, chilling laugh that didn't reach her eyes. "I'm taking what I deserve. I married into this family. I've lived here, the law's on my side. The law, I said, my voice trembling, doesn't protect liars. For a second, she looked almost afraid. Then the mask returned. We'll see about that, Mother Walker, she said, her tone dripping with mockery. You think your past matters here. You're just a bitter old woman with a fading name. And just like that, she turned and walked upstairs, heels clicking like hammers on marble. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat by the window watching the rain smear the streetlights into blurs of gold and gray. My mind wandered to Thomas's last words, "Don't go down quietly." So I didn't. The next morning, I called an old friend from my legal days, Detective Raymond Jones. "Ray," I said, my voice low, "I need your help." He sighed on the other end. "You back in the game, Evelyn?" "No," I said, "I'm back in the fight." He chuckled softly. "Then I'll get you what you need." A week later, he came by with a manila folder. Inside were photographs, call logs, and documents, Vanessa and a man named Derek Cole, the same name I'd seen on that hotel receipt. Derek was no ordinary man. He was a real estate investor with a reputation for seducing women and flipping their assets like they were properties. "She's playing a dangerous game," Raymond said, shaking his head. "He's got money, but no morals." "I know the type," I replied quietly. "They always think decency is weakness." He looked at me for a long moment. "You know this could get ugly, right?" "It already is," I said. The following days were filled with silence and strategy. I hid the folder under my mattress, prayed for patience, and watched as Vanessa's lies piled up like dirty dishes. She'd whisper on the phone, fake smiles at breakfast, and kiss Lily on the forehead before leaving for her so-called meetings. One evening, Lily climbed onto my lap, her small hands clutching mine. "Grandma," she whispered, "Mommy said we might move to a new house. I don't want to leave Dad." My heart cracked open. I hugged her tightly, inhaling the scent of her shampoo, that innocent sweetness the world hadn't touched yet. "You won't go anywhere, baby," I promised. "Not if Grandma's here." When Vanessa returned that night, her laughter filled the doorway, but her eyes were cold. She looked at Marcus, then at me. "Let's talk," she said. Her tone wasn't a request, it was a declaration. And as she placed a thick stack of papers on the table, I knew the battle had officially begun. The divorce papers, the war lines drawn. Love, once soft and sacred, had turned into something sharp enough to cut. And in that moment, I made a silent vow. If she wanted a war, she'd picked the wrong mother to fight. The divorce papers lay on the kitchen table like a declaration of war, sharp, cold, final. The smell of ink mixed with the faint scent of Vanessa's perfume, that same vanilla note that once filled the house with warmth and now only brought nausea. Marcus stared at the papers without touching them. His fingers twitched, hovering just above the signature line, trembling like leaves caught in a storm. "Vanessa," he said finally, his voice raw. "After everything, is this really what you want?" She didn't look at him. She was standing by the window, her back turned, arms crossed tightly as if holding herself together. "What I want," she said, "is to stop pretending. This," she gestured around the room at the cracked tiles, the flickering light, the small home that had seen so much love, "this isn't a life. I'm tired of struggling." Marcus swallowed hard. "Struggling, we had a life. Maybe not perfect, but real." She laughed softly, bitterly. Real doesn't pay bills. Real doesn't buy happiness, Marcus." I sat quietly in the corner, watching the two of them. There was nothing left to say that wouldn't turn into another wound. Love had turned into something brittle, all edges, no softness. When Vanessa finally turned toward him, her eyes were already somewhere else. "You can keep your pity," she said. "I just want my share." "Your share?" I couldn't stay silent any longer. "This house was built by Marcus long before you married him. You have no legal right to it." Her lips twisted into that cruel, practiced smile. "Oh, Mrs. Walker, you're still living in the past. In case you haven't noticed, marriage changes things. Assets get shared. That's how the law works." I met her gaze steady. "You're right. The law does protect the rightful owner. And in this case, that's my son. Marcus looked at me, confusion flickering in his tired eyes. I could see he didn't have the strength for this fight, not yet, but I did. Vanessa slammed her palm against the table, the sound cracking through the kitchen like thunder. You think you can scare me with your lawyer talk? Please, you're just an old woman with a memory of power. I have the evidence. The years, the witnesses, you'll lose. I didn't answer. Because I knew what she didn't, I'd already started collecting my own evidence. The next few days blurred into a haze of tension. Vanessa stayed in the guest room, slamming doors and avoiding eye contact. Marcus moved slower, his crutches echoing down the hall like the ticking of a countdown. Lily tried to keep smiling, coloring pictures at the kitchen table, but her drawings had changed. She no longer drew happy stick figures holding hands. Now they stood apart, one tall, one small, a gap between them filled with blue scribbles that looked like rain. I kept my composure, but inside, a storm brewed. Every time I looked at my son, I saw not just his pain, but my own reflection, all the years I'd fought to give him safety, only to see it unravel in the hands of a woman who measured love by profit. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the houses and the air turned gold, Vanessa's parents arrived. They came in like royalty, her mother in pearls, her father in a navy suit that smelled faintly of cigars. Their voices were polished, their smiles rehearsed. "Mrs. Walker," her father said with a sympathetic tilt of his head, "this has all become unfortunate, but surely we can resolve it with dignity." "Dignity?" I asked, folding my hands. "You mean without consequence?" Her mother stepped forward, her tone dripping with condescension. "Our daughter has rights. She gave her best years to this family, to this man. She gave him cruelty when he needed compassion," I said quietly. "And you raised her that way to take, not to love." The air crackled. Even Vanessa seemed startled by the venom in my words. Her father cleared his throat. "Let's not make this ugly." "Oh, it's already ugly," I said, standing now. "Your daughter made sure of that when she betrayed her vows and tried to steal what wasn't hers." Vanessa's mother gasped. "Steal, that's a serious accusation." "So is adultery," I replied evenly. Marcus's eyes widened. "Mom," he whispered, "please," but it was too late. The truth was already halfway out, and I wasn't about to pull it back in. After they left, Vanessa stormed into the kitchen, her heels striking the floor like gunfire. "You had no right to speak to them that way," she shouted. "I have every right to defend my son," I said. "This isn't your fight. It became mine the moment you tried to destroy him." Her eyes blazed. "You think you scare me because you used to be a lawyer? You're just a washed-up widow living off a dead man's charity." The words hit me harder than I expected, but I didn't flinch. "You're right about one thing," I said slowly. "Thomas did help us, but he didn't do it for charity. He did it because he believed in goodness, something you'll never understand." For the first time, her voice trembled. "Don't bring him into this." "Oh, but he's already part of it," I said softly. "Because his name is on the papers that say this house belongs to my son, and soon those papers will be in court." Her face went pale, just for a second. Then she smiled again, that icy, dangerous smile I'd come to recognize as her armor. "You don't know who you're dealing with, old woman," she hissed. I leaned closer, my voice a whisper. "Neither do you." Later that night, I found Marcus sitting on the porch, staring out at the dark. "Mom," he said quietly, "maybe it's better if I let her have it, the house, everything." I turned sharply. "Don't you dare. She'll make it hell for all of us. Maybe if I give her what she wants, she'll go away." "She'll never go away," I said. "You don't feed a wolf and expect it to stop hunting." He looked at me then, tears in his eyes. "I don't have the strength for this fight." "Then borrow mine," I said. "You gave me purpose when your father died. Now it's my turn to fight for you." For a long moment, he said nothing. Then he nodded, and something in his posture shifted, not strength yet, but surrender to the idea that maybe I could carry this battle until he could stand again. 2 days later, a letter arrived from the court. The divorce petition had been filed. The hearing was scheduled in 3 weeks. I placed it on the table beside my old leather briefcase, the same one I hadn't opened in years, the same one I carried into every courtroom of my past life. I dusted it off, running my fingers along the cracked leather, and whispered to myself, "It's time." When I looked up, my reflection in the window didn't look like a tired widow anymore. It looked like the woman I used to be, the one who stood for justice, who stared corruption in the face and didn't blink. The war Vanessa had started was about to meet the mother who'd forgotten how to lose. The morning after the court notice arrived, the world outside seemed cruelly ordinary. Birds sang, neighbors watered their lawns. Somewhere down the street, a child's laughter drifted through the air, light, unbroken, unaware. But inside our home, time had stopped. Marcus sat at the kitchen table staring into a cup of untouched coffee. The circles under his eyes were darker now, and his shoulders sagged like he was carrying invisible bricks. Vanessa had already left for one of her meetings. The echo of her heels still haunted the hallway. I stood by the sink, washing the same plate over and over, trying to quiet the storm in my head. 3 weeks until the hearing, 3 weeks to protect everything we'd built, our home, our dignity, our truth. I had spent decades walking away from the law, but it seemed that now the law was walking straight back toward me. Detective Raymond Jones called that afternoon. "Evelyn," he said, his voice low, gravelly, "you might want to sit down for this." I gripped the phone tighter. "What did you find?" He hesitated. "More than enough." We met later that evening at a small cafe near the courthouse, the same cafe where I had once sat with Thomas Reed years ago. The same smell of roasted beans, the same flickering neon sign that hummed like a tired heartbeat. Raymond arrived with a manila envelope tucked under his arm. His trench coat was soaked from the drizzle outside. He sat across from me and placed the envelope on the table without a word. When I opened it, I saw photographs, clear, color, undeniable. Vanessa and a man stepping out of the Metropolitan Grand Hotel, his arm wrapped around her waist. Her smile, that radiant, rehearsed smile, directed at him like a spotlight. The man was tall, sharp-suited, handsome in the expensive kind of way, but his eyes were hollow, predatory. "His name's Derek Cole," Raymond said, "real estate investor, known for flipping more than just properties. He's got a trail of lawsuits behind him, all women, all with something he took." "And she's next," I whispered. He nodded grimly. "He's already transferred funds into her account. Large ones. She's helping him with something, maybe a property sale or a laundering scheme. Hard to tell yet." I closed the envelope. "She's trying to liquidate the house," I said quietly. "Use Marcus's name, claim half, sell fast, and walk away clean." Raymond sighed. "It's all there, Evelyn. Evidence, the bank transfers, the photos, the calls." He slid another smaller envelope across the table. "And this, a recording from a hotel lobby camera. Timestamp matches the nights she said she was working late." I sat still for a long while, staring at the city lights blurring through the window. Each one looked like a confession. Finally, I asked, "Can you get me her call records, specifically the ones involving Cole?" He hesitated. "You sure you want to see that?" "I've spent half my life defending truth," I said. "The least I can do now is face it." That night, after Marcus and Lily were asleep, I locked my bedroom door and spread the evidence across my bed. Photographs, bank statements, screenshots, pieces of a puzzle that spelled betrayal in every language. In one of the photos, Vanessa was wearing the same red dress she'd worn to our last Sunday dinner. The one she said was for a charity event. I remembered complimenting her, "You look lovely, dear," while she smiled and thanked me, already living a double life. I stared at that picture for a long time. My anger came in waves, but under it all there was something deeper sorrow. For the woman she could have been, for the love she'd thrown away like loose change, for the family she was willing to destroy for greed. I thought of Marcus, still believing, still hoping she might come back to her senses, and I knew I couldn't let him face this truth alone. Not yet, so I gathered everything, slid it into my old leather briefcase, and locked it. That sound, click, was the same sound I'd made the day I walked away from the courtroom years ago. Only this time it wasn't an ending, it was a beginning. The next morning, I found Marcus sitting in the living room, holding one of Lily's drawings. It was a house like ours with 3 figures, but one was crossed out in red crayon. "She drew this last night," he said softly. My heart ached. "Children see more than we think." He looked up at me, his voice breaking. "Mom, what if Vanessa's right? What if I've become a burden?" I kneeled beside him, took his trembling hand. "You are not a burden," I said firmly. "You are a man who worked, who bled, who built. You are my son, and you are not defined by what broke you." Tears filled his eyes, but he didn't let them fall. He just nodded, whispering, "I wish Dad were here." "He is," I said softly. "In every fight we keep fighting." That night I overheard Vanessa in Lily's room. Her voice was sharp, impatient. "Listen to me," she said. "Tomorrow, if anyone asks, you tell them you don't want to live here anymore, okay? You want to go with Mommy." Lily's small voice trembled. "But I want to stay with Daddy and Grandma." Vanessa's tone hardened. "If you don't, we'll lose everything. Do you want to see Daddy cry again?" The words sliced through me like glass. I pressed my hand over my mouth, holding back a gasp. When Vanessa left the room, I slipped in quietly. Lily sat on the edge of her bed, clutching her teddy bear, tears glistening on her cheeks. "Grandma," she whispered, "I don't want to lie." I gathered her into my arms, rocking her gently. "You don't have to, baby. The truth is the strongest thing we have." She nodded, her small voice trembling. "But Mommy said," I touched her cheek, "your Mommy's confused right now, but you're brave, and brave people tell the truth." The next morning, Vanessa strutted into the kitchen wearing that same red dress from the photos. "Big day," she said, sipping her coffee. "My lawyer's coming by later." I looked up from the sink. "Jennifer Rivers," her eyes narrowed. "How do you know her name?" I smiled faintly. "Chicago's a small city." She studied me for a moment, suspicion flickering across her face. Then she shrugged. "Well, you can tell your son to start packing, because once this is over, I'm taking what's mine." I wiped my hands and turned to her, calm but steady. "You can only take what's yours, Vanessa, and lies don't count." She laughed. "We'll see, Mother Walker. You're good at speeches. Maybe you should have been a lawyer." "I was," I said quietly. Her smile faltered. Just for a second. That night, I opened the briefcase one last time. Every piece of proof, every photo, every receipt organized, labeled, ready. I ran my fingers over the leather and whispered to the ghost of Thomas Reed. "You told me not to go down quietly. I won't." The city outside was asleep, but inside that small house on Maple Avenue, something powerful was awakening. Not vengeance, not rage, but resolve. I wasn't just fighting for a house anymore. I was fighting for my son, for my granddaughter, for every woman who had ever been told to stay silent for the sake of peace. And I promised myself, as the rain began to fall against the windows, that when I walked into that courtroom again, this time, justice would wear the face of a mother. By the time dawn broke, the rain had stopped, leaving the streets glistening like polished mirrors. The world outside looked washed clean, but inside me, something old had begun to stir, a presence I hadn't felt in years. It was quiet at first, like a faint echo in my chest, but as the morning light crept across the kitchen floor, I knew exactly what it was. The lawyer in me had woken up. For decades, I'd buried her beneath motherhood, grief, and guilt. After Samuel's death, after the corruption case that nearly broke my faith in justice, I promised myself I'd never step foot in another courtroom. I told myself that being a mother was enough, that love could be its own kind of justice. But standing there in my old house, watching my son limp across the hallway and my granddaughter clutch her teddy bear like a shield, I realized love without protection was just hope in chains. It was time to break those chains. That morning, I put on a long beige coat and left the house before Marcus or Lily woke up. The city was still half asleep, the air thick with that gray Chicago cold that seeps into your bones. My destination wasn't far, just 12 blocks south, down to Jefferson Street, where an old law office still bore the faint traces of my past life. The brass plaque outside was tarnished now, Jones and Walker Legal Associates. I hadn't seen that name in over 20 years. The door creaked open when I pushed it. Dust motes swirled in the sunlight, dancing above the same oak desk where I had once fought battles that made headlines. Behind it sat a man whose face time had weathered but not softened, Detective Raymond Jones, my former partner in justice, and at times my conscience when mine faltered. He looked up, surprise flickering behind his glasses. "Well, I'll be damned," he said, standing. "Evelyn Walker, the lioness herself." I smiled faintly. "You still call me that?" He shrugged. "Hard habit to break, you earned it." He gestured toward a chair. I sat down, running my fingers along the edge of the desk, tracing old scars in the wood. "Feels smaller than I remember. Or maybe you got bigger," he said with a grin. Then his tone softened. "You ready to come back?" I exhaled slowly. "I don't think I ever left. I just forgot who I was for a while." He leaned back, studying me. "I heard about your son, and about Vanessa." "Of course you did," I said. "Bad news travels fast." "She's connected," he said. "Cole's got friends in high places. Lawyers, judges, real estate moguls. This isn't just a family case, Evelyn. This is business. The kind that buries people." "I've been buried before," I said quietly. "And I've crawled out." Raymond nodded, respect flashing in his eyes. "So what's your plan?" I opened my bag and pulled out the folder he'd given me days earlier, the photographs, the receipts, the recordings. Then I placed one more item on the desk, a small silver flash drive. "This," I said, tapping it, "contains everything I've gathered. Her calls, his payments, the property transfer drafts she tried to file under Marcus's name. It's enough to make her case collapse before it starts." He whistled low. "You never lost your touch." I didn't have the luxury to. We spent the next 3 hours going over details, timelines, names, connections. Every minute peeled away another layer of the years I'd tried to forget. My mind sharpened with every argument, every line of evidence. It was like muscle memory. The rhythm of justice had never truly left me. When we finished, Raymond leaned forward, elbows on the desk. "You know," he said, "you could just hand this to the police, let them deal with it. And let them bury it under politics and paperwork." I shook my head. "No, this isn't just about winning. It's about making sure she can never do this to anyone else." He chuckled softly. "Still the same old fire." I met his gaze. "Fire's all that kept me alive." Before I left, he handed me a small envelope. Inside was a sealed court registration form. "You'll need to renew your legal credentials if you're planning to represent Marcus," he said. I looked at the form, the familiar language printed in black ink, Illinois Bar Reinstatement Application. It felt like destiny written on paper. "Welcome back to the fight, counselor," Raymond said. That night, after I put Lily to bed, I sat at the dining table filling out the form by lamplight. The pen felt heavy in my hand. Each word I wrote carried a piece of the woman I once was, the woman who had fought corruption, exposed greed, and paid the price for it. When I finished signing, I closed my eyes and whispered to the quiet room, "This time, I'm not fighting for strangers. I'm fighting for blood." I folded the papers neatly and placed them inside my briefcase. Over the next few days, the transformation began quietly. I spent mornings rereading case law, afternoons calling old colleagues, evenings reviewing evidence. I visited the courthouse archives, the smell of dust and old justice filling my lungs. Clerks who had known me in my prime stared in surprise. "Mrs. Walker," one of them whispered. "Are you coming back?" I smiled, just visiting an old battlefield. But the truth was, I was already back. Every detail I uncovered about Vanessa's plot only hardened my resolve. The bank transfers linked directly to Derek Cole's company, Urban Stone Developments, hidden under shell accounts, laundering real estate money through divorce settlements. Vanessa wasn't just betraying her husband, she was laundering his life. It was bigger than I'd thought and far uglier. One evening, Marcus walked into the study and found me surrounded by files. He stood there silently for a moment before asking, "Mom, what are you doing?" I looked up. "Preparing. For what? For war." He frowned. "You can't fight her in court, you're not a lawyer anymore." I smiled softly. "Then I guess it's time to change that." He shook his head. "Mom, I don't want you to get dragged into this." "It's too late," I said gently. "She dragged me in the moment she made our home her battlefield." He hesitated, then sat beside me. "You think we can win?" I met his eyes, and for the first time in a long time, I saw a spark in his. "We won't just win," I said. "We'll make them remember who we are." That night, as the city hummed under the glow of streetlights, I stood by the window, looking out at the skyline Thomas Reed had once built. His towers gleamed like monuments to everything that still mattered: integrity, perseverance, legacy. And somewhere between those lights, I imagined his voice again. "Don't go down quietly." "I won't," I whispered back. Not this time, because the past I had buried was no longer a ghost, it was a weapon. And when the day came to walk into that courtroom again, I wouldn't walk in as a broken widow or a grieving mother. I would walk in as Evelyn Walker, the lioness of law, and this time, I wasn't defending clients. I was defending family. The morning of the hearing arrived with a pale, reluctant sun. The city was still half asleep, wrapped in fog and silence. Yet, as I stood before the mirror, buttoning my navy blue blazer, I could almost hear the echo of old courtrooms, gavels striking, papers rustling, hearts breaking. I hadn't worn that suit in nearly 20 years. The fabric had faded at the seams, and the shoulders felt heavier than I remembered. But when I looked at my reflection, I didn't see an aging widow anymore. I saw the woman I used to be, the one who fought giants and never bowed. Downstairs, Marcus was waiting by the door, his crutches leaning against his chair. He looked nervous, but there was pride in his eyes, too. "Mom," he said softly, "you sure about this?" I smiled. "Baby, I've been sure since the day she tried to take what wasn't hers." We drove in silence through the gray streets of Chicago. Lily was with a neighbor. She didn't need to see this war. When we reached the courthouse, reporters already lined the steps, cameras ready, whispers floating through the cold air. The Walker divorce trial. To them, it was just another headline. To us, it was everything. Vanessa arrived moments later in a sleek black car, dressed in emerald green, confident, calculated, every inch the actress she'd become. Her parents followed close behind, their eyes scanning the crowd like royalty walking through peasants. When she saw me helping Marcus out of the car, her smile faltered for a second, just long enough to reveal a flash of fear. Inside, the courtroom was colder than I remembered. The air smelled of old wood and tension. The judge, Richard Cole, sat poised behind his bench, silver-haired, dignified, and unaware that his morning would soon turn into history. He nodded at the bailiff. "Court is now in session." Vanessa's lawyer, Jennifer Rivers, rose first, young, sharp, and smug. Her voice carried easily through the room. "Your Honor," she began, "my client, Mrs. Vanessa Walker, has endured years of emotional and financial strain. Mr. Marcus Walker is physically incapacitated and unable to fulfill his marital responsibilities. Therefore, we request a divorce and fair division of assets, including the marital home." I sat beside Marcus, hands folded, eyes steady. When Jennifer finished, Vanessa gave a soft, rehearsed sigh and dabbed at her eyes with a silk handkerchief. The performance was perfect. Even the reporters in the back leaned forward, ready to capture the tears. Then the judge turned toward our table. Mr. Walker, do you have representation? Marcus hesitated, glancing at me. I could feel his pulse racing through the table. I stood slowly, smoothing my blazer. The room quieted. Yes, Your Honor, I said clearly. He does. The judge frowned. And you are? I stepped forward. Evelyn Walker, counsel for the defendant. The moment hung suspended in air. Jennifer blinked, confused. Vanessa's head snapped up, disbelief flashing in her eyes. Even the judge froze mid-motion, the gavel slipping slightly in his hand. Mrs. Walker, he said softly. Evelyn Walker. Whispers rippled through the room like a rising tide. Is that? It can't be. The lioness of law? I met Judge Cole's gaze. It's been a long time, Your Honor. He leaned back slowly, a mix of respect and shock in his expression. I remember you. You once defended the Carter corruption case. And won, I said simply. Vanessa's face drained of color. Jennifer's confident smirk vanished, replaced by uncertainty. Judge Cole cleared his throat. Well then, this just got interesting. When the testimonies began, Jennifer presented documents, bank statements, and rehearsed declarations about emotional neglect and financial instability. It was a familiar script, the kind designed to manipulate sympathy. I let her finish, let her weave her story. And when she was done, I rose slowly, carrying my briefcase to the center of the courtroom. Your Honor, I said, voice calm but strong, I'd like to submit evidence that may clarify a few misunderstandings. Jennifer crossed her arms. Objection, Your Honor, this evidence wasn't pre-filed. Judge Cole lifted a hand. Overruled. Proceed, Mrs. Walker. I opened the briefcase. The click echoed through the room. Out came the first set of documents, the property deed to the house. This, I said, holding it up, is the original purchase record for the property in question, dated 3 years before my son's marriage, registered solely under his name and verified by Mr. Thomas Reed, now deceased. The clerk took the documents and passed them to the judge. He scanned them, his eyebrows rising. Authentic, he murmured. A murmur rippled through the spectators. Vanessa's parents exchanged worried glances. Jennifer leaned toward her client, whispering frantically, but I wasn't finished. Your Honor, I continued, while property ownership is a matter of law, what concerns me more is the matter of truth. I gestured to the clerk again, who now held a small USB drive. I'd like to play a recording. The judge nodded. The clerk inserted the drive. Then came the sound, Vanessa's voice, sharp and unmistakable. Lily, tomorrow in court, you'll tell the judge you don't want to live here anymore. You want to be with Mommy. Understand? A pause. Then Lily's small, trembling voice. But I love Daddy. I don't want to lie. Vanessa's tone hardened. If you don't, we'll lose everything. Do you want to see Daddy cry again? Gasps erupted across the courtroom. Someone in the back muttered, "My God." Vanessa jumped to her feet. That's fake, that's fabricated. But her voice cracked, betraying her panic. Judge Cole struck his gavel. Order, order in the court. He turned to Vanessa, his expression dark. Mrs. Walker, that was your voice? She stammered, I don't, it's taken out of context. But no one believed her. I took a slow breath. Your Honor, this is not a woman seeking fairness. This is a woman seeking fortune. She has manipulated her daughter, deceived her husband, and conspired with Mr. Derek Cole, a known real estate fraud, to steal this home. Jennifer Rivers tried to object again, but her voice faltered. Her hands trembled over her notes. I looked at Marcus. Tears glistened in his eyes, but his chin was lifted high. Then I turned back to the judge. Your Honor, I'm not here asking for pity or revenge. I'm asking for justice. For a man who built a home from dust, for a child who deserves truth, and for a family that's been torn apart by greed. The silence that followed was absolute. You could hear nothing but the faint hum of the ceiling fan and the distant sound of city sirens. Judge Cole's gaze lingered on me, and in that moment something changed, not just in the room, but in the air itself. He leaned forward slightly, his voice low but firm. "Mrs. Walker, it's an honor to have you back in my courtroom." And then, turning to Vanessa, he said, "We'll resume with witness testimonies tomorrow. But for now, I suggest you prepare for the truth." The gavel struck once, loud and final. As the courtroom emptied, I gathered my papers in silence. Marcus reached for my hand. "Mom," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion, "you were incredible." I smiled faintly. "We're not done yet, baby. We just woke the court up." Outside, the sun finally broke through the fog, pale, fragile, but unmistakably real. And as I stepped out of the courthouse, I knew that justice, long asleep, had finally begun to awaken. The next morning, Chicago was bathed in a strange, golden quiet, the kind of silence that only comes before something irreversible. I woke before dawn, the city still cloaked in fog, and sat by the window with a cup of black coffee. The courthouse loomed faintly in the distance, a shadow among shadows. I thought about all the times I'd sat in that same chair years ago, reading bedtime stories to Marcus, sewing his school uniforms, praying over bills I didn't know how to pay. And now here I was, preparing to defend him in front of a judge, fighting not just for our home, but for our dignity. Some people spend their lives waiting for justice. Others, mothers, learn to become it. When I arrived at the courthouse, the crowd was even larger than the day before. Reporters pressed close to the steps, their breath fogging up the cold morning air. "Mrs. Walker," one of them called out, "is it true you're representing your own son?" Another shouted, "Are you really the lioness of law?" I didn't answer. I didn't need to. My silence said everything. Inside, the courtroom buzzed with tension. Vanessa sat at the defendant's table, her emerald dress replaced with black mourning the empire she thought she'd built. Her lawyer, Jennifer Rivers, looked pale, her hands trembling slightly as she shuffled through her papers. Marcus sat beside me, calmer than before. I could feel his quiet strength growing like a broken branch learning to bloom again. Then Judge Cole entered, gavel in hand. "Court is in session," he said, his tone solemn. "We'll proceed with the continuation of Walker v.s. Walker." He looked at me first. "Mrs. Walker, you may begin." I rose, carrying my briefcase to the stand. "Your Honor," I said, "yesterday we established that the property in question was purchased by my son before his marriage. Today, we'll show that the plaintiff's motives were not legal but malicious, and that this divorce is part of a larger scheme involving fraud and coercion." Jennifer Rivers stood quickly. "Objection! These are baseless accusations meant to defame my client." Judge Cole turned to her. "If they are baseless, Ms. Rivers, then I trust Mrs. Walker will fail to prove them. Let's hear the evidence." The room went quiet again. I took out a small stack of documents, bank records, money transfers, emails. "These transactions," I said, "show that Mrs. Vanessa Walker received over $150,000 from Urbanstone Developments, a company owned by Derek Cole, the same man seen accompanying her at the Metropolitan Grand Hotel." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Cameras clicked. Jennifer's voice trembled. "That's circumstantial. My client was consulting on a real estate deal." "Then why," I interrupted, "did those transfers coincide exactly with the dates she filed for divorce? Why did she try to list the marital home under joint property when it legally never was? And why did she instruct her daughter, an 8-year-old child, to lie in this very court?" Vanessa's face flushed crimson. "That's not true," she cried. "You're twisting everything." I turned to her, calm but sharp. "Then explain it, Vanessa. Explain why every piece of your story leads back to greed." Her lips parted, but no sound came out. She looked toward Jennifer, but her lawyer's eyes were downcast. There are moments in life when truth doesn't need witnesses. It simply stands on its own, undeniable. "Your Honor," I continued, "I would like to call our next witness, Detective Raymond Jones." Raymond entered the courtroom, his presence steady and deliberate. The years had grayed his hair, but not his voice. He took the oath, then faced the judge. "Detective Jones," I began, "you've been following Mr. Derek Cole's activities." "Correct. Yes, ma'am, for nearly a decade." "And what did you find concerning his connection to my daughter-in-law?" Raymond pulled out a folder. "Records of communication, financial transfers, and property proposals that list both Mr. Cole and Mrs. Walker as beneficiaries. It appears Mr. Cole intended to use her as a front to secure ownership of the Walker residence." The courtroom erupted again. "Furthermore," Raymond said, "Cole has a history of manipulating women through fraudulent partnerships. He's currently under federal investigation for property laundering." Jennifer's voice cracked. "Objection." "Overruled," Judge Cole said firmly. Vanessa's hands were shaking now. The woman who had walked into this courtroom in diamonds and defiance was dissolving under the weight of her own lies. Raymond glanced at me, then nodded. "That's all, ma'am." I smiled faintly. "Thank you, detective." I turned back toward the judge. "Your Honor, this isn't about revenge, it's about truth. A truth that should have never needed a courtroom to be heard." Then I reached for the final piece of evidence, a printed letter. This was found in the possession of Mr. Derek Cole during his last police inquiry. Judge Cole took it, reading silently, his brows furrowed. Vanessa finally broke her silence. "That letter," but he cut her off. "This is a proposal for the sale of the Walker home, signed by you, Mrs. Walker, and dated before you filed for divorce." The room froze. Vanessa's voice turned desperate. "He made me. I didn't know what I was signing." "Mrs. Walker," the judge said coldly, "you're under oath. Did you or did you not sign this document?" Her shoulders slumped. "Yes," she whispered. That single word ended everything. When the recess was called, the courtroom exploded into noise. Reporters swarmed the aisles, people whispered my name like it belonged to a legend that had come back to life. I sat quietly beside Marcus, watching him stare at the empty seat across the room where Vanessa had been. His expression wasn't angry anymore, just tired. "Mom," he said softly, "how do you do it? How do you stay so calm when people try to destroy you?" I smiled faintly. "Because I've learned that anger burns fast, but truth lasts." He nodded slowly, and for the first time in years, I saw him sit a little straighter. The broken man who once believed he was a burden now looked like someone who remembered his worth. When court resumed, Judge Cole's tone was firm and final. "After reviewing the evidence and witness testimony, it is clear that this case was built on deceit. Mrs. Vanessa Walker's claims to the property are dismissed. Custody of the child will be awarded to Mr. Marcus Walker and Mrs. Evelyn Walker. A formal ruling will be issued tomorrow." His gavel struck once, and just like that, justice finally spoke. The sound echoed through the chamber, long and deep like thunder after a long drought. As we left the courtroom, a reporter called out, "Mrs. Walker, how does it feel to win?" I paused at the top of the courthouse steps, the cold wind brushing against my face. "It doesn't feel like winning," I said. "It feels like coming home." That night, the house was quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet. Marcus sat at the table sketching new designs for a project. Lily slept upstairs, clutching her teddy bear. And I stood by the window, watching the city lights shimmer against the night sky. Thomas used to say, "Justice doesn't sleep. It just waits for someone brave enough to wake it." For years, I thought he meant lawyers. Now I understood. He meant mothers. And as I turned off the lamp and let the house sink into peace, I realized the fight was almost over. But the healing, that was just beginning. The morning of the verdict was unnaturally still. Even the wind seemed to hesitate outside the window, as if the city itself was waiting. I woke before sunrise and stood for a long moment in the quiet of my kitchen. The air smelled of coffee and rain. The same old leather briefcase sat on the counter, scarred, faithful, heavy with everything that had brought me to this day. I ran my hand over it and whispered, "One last time." Marcus came in quietly, dressed in his best shirt, his crutches glinting faintly in the early light. "Mom," he said, "whatever happens today, thank you." I smiled. "Don't thank me yet, baby. Thank me when this house is truly yours again." We didn't speak much after that. Some days, silence says everything words can't. The courthouse was already crowded when we arrived. The marble steps gleamed in the pale morning light, polished by anticipation. Reporters murmured, cameras flashed, and the same faces from the day before waited, hungry for an ending. Vanessa arrived moments later. Gone was the confident woman who'd once strutted in like she owned the world. Her eyes were hollow, rimmed with sleeplessness. She wore no makeup this time, just a black coat that swallowed her thin frame. Even her parents followed her from a distance, silent, ashamed. Inside, the room was thick with tension. The wooden benches creaked as people leaned forward. You could almost hear their hearts beating. Judge Richard Cole entered precisely at 9. He took his seat, the gavel resting beside his hand like a symbol of finality. "This court," he said, "will now deliver its verdict." For a moment, he looked down at the papers in front of him, his glasses catching the morning light. Then he lifted his gaze toward us. After reviewing all evidence, testimony, and documentation, he began, his voice clear and deliberate. "The court finds that the property known as 417 Maple Avenue is the sole and rightful possession of Mr. Marcus Walker. The plaintiff's claims to joint ownership are hereby dismissed." A murmur spread through the room, a wave of relief that crashed softly against the silence. Judge Cole continued, "Furthermore, in consideration of the welfare of the minor, Lily Walker, primary custody will be awarded to Mr. Walker and Mrs. Evelyn Walker. Mrs. Vanessa Walker will have visitation rights under court supervision, pending review of her conduct." He paused, his eyes softening. "This court does not take pleasure in division, but it must uphold truth even when truth cuts deep." And then, with one final strike of the gavel, he said, "This session is adjourned." The sharp crack echoed through the room like thunder, clean, final, righteous. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then Marcus exhaled a sound half-laugh, half-sob, and buried his face in his hands. I reached for him, pulling him close. His shoulders shook, and I felt decades of pain and fear pouring out of him at once. "You did it, Mom," he whispered, his voice cracking. "You really did it." "No," I said softly, holding him tighter. "We did." Across the room, Vanessa sat motionless, her head bowed, her hands clenched in her lap as if still trying to hold onto something that had already slipped away. For the first time, I didn't feel anger when I looked at her. Only sorrow. Because beneath the lies and greed, I saw what was left, a woman who'd gambled everything for power and lost herself in the process. When she finally lifted her eyes to meet mine, I saw tears there, not of guilt, but of recognition. The kind that only comes when it's too late. She whispered, just loud enough for me to hear, "I didn't mean for it to go this far." I nodded slowly. "We rarely do." And then she looked away, shoulders trembling, the fight gone from her at last. Outside the courthouse, the world had turned bright again. The storm clouds were gone, and sunlight spilled across the steps like mercy. Reporters swarmed around us. "Mrs. Walker, what do you have to say about the verdict? Do you feel vindicated?" I stopped at the top of the stairs and looked at them, the same crowd that had watched our pain for weeks, waiting for sound bites. "This wasn't about victory," I said. "It was about truth. Justice doesn't belong to lawyers or judges, it belongs to those who refuse to give up on what's right." Flashes went off. Pens scribbled, but I was already done talking. Marcus put a hand on my shoulder. "Let's go home." Home? When we arrived, Lily came running out of the house, her tiny arms flying through the air. "Daddy," she screamed. "Grandma." Marcus dropped his crutches and caught her in his arms, holding her tight, laughing through tears. "I told you we'd be okay, baby girl," he said, kissing her hair. I stood a few steps behind, my heart full and quiet. The orange tree in the yard shimmered under the sunlight, its leaves whispering softly in the breeze. For the first time in years, the house didn't feel haunted anymore. It felt alive. That evening, we cooked together chili just like Thomas used to love. The kitchen was filled with warmth and noise and laughter. Marcus hummed an old song while stirring the pot. Lily set the table, proud of her crookedly folded napkins. When we finally sat down to eat, I looked across the table and saw something I hadn't seen in a long time: peace. Not the loud kind, not the triumphant kind, but the quiet, enduring peace that comes after a storm when the heart stops bracing for thunder. Lily looked at me and said, "Grandma, are you happy now?" I smiled. "Yes, baby, I'm happy. Even though Mommy's gone." I took her hand gently. "Sometimes love has to let go to stay true, and someday your mom will understand that too." She nodded slowly, as if she believed me more than I believed myself. Later that night, after everyone went to bed, I sat alone on the porch. The air was cool, sweet with the smell of rain-soaked earth. The stars above Chicago glittered faintly through the city haze, quiet witnesses to everything we'd survived. I thought about all the battles behind me, the courtroom fights, the betrayals, the heartbreaks. But for the first time, none of it hurt, because every scar was proof that I hadn't surrendered. In the reflection of the window, I saw not a lawyer or a widow, but a mother who had stood her ground. A woman who had learned that justice doesn't come from power or law books, but from love, fierce, unconditional, unbreakable. Somewhere in the distance, church bells began to ring. Slow, solemn, beautiful. I closed my eyes and whispered, "You were right, Thomas, justice doesn't sleep, it just waits." And as their echoes faded into the quiet night, I knew that at last, we were free. It's strange how quiet the world feels once the storm has passed. For months, I had lived with the weight of every lie, every courtroom whisper, every sleepless night wondering whether truth would survive. And then one day, it did. Peace doesn't arrive like thunder. It comes softly, like sunlight sneaking through the blinds, like laughter drifting down a hallway. It had been 3 months since the verdict. 3 months since Marcus had reclaimed not just his home, but himself. Life was simple again. Morning coffee on the porch, Lily chasing butterflies in the yard, the sound of her laughter filling the air like music. Sometimes I'd just stand there, hands on my hips, watching them, a man learning to walk again and a child teaching him how to live while doing it. The scars were still there, of course, some visible, some not, but they no longer ached. The orange tree by the porch had bloomed early that spring. Its blossoms carried a scent that reminded me of forgiveness, light, unexpected, and stronger than pain. Marcus had returned to work part-time, teaching electrical engineering at the community college nearby. It wasn't the construction site where he used to build skyscrapers, but it built something more lasting: dignity. "Mom," he told me one evening, setting down his books, "I used to think strength meant never falling, but you showed me it's about standing up again, even when your legs don't want to." I smiled, brushing his hair like I used to when he was a boy. "Strength isn't about how much you carry, Marcus. It's about who you carry it for." He nodded quietly. "Then I guess we're both strong." As for Vanessa, word around the neighborhood said she'd left the city. Some claimed she went south, others that she moved in with relatives. No one really knew. One day, a small envelope arrived in the mail. No return address. Just my name written in careful, familiar handwriting. Inside was a short letter. "Evelyn, you were right, I lost myself. I thought love was something to own, not something to keep safe. I don't expect forgiveness, but I needed you to know that I'm sorry for Marcus, for Lily, for everything. Tell her her mother loves her. Vanessa." I read it twice. then folded it slowly, pressing it against my chest. Forgiveness doesn't erase what happened, but it frees you from carrying it forever. And that day, I finally let her go. One Sunday morning, Lily came running into my room, her curls bouncing, her hands clutching a piece of paper. "Grandma, look," she said, holding up a drawing. It was a picture of 3 people, me, Marcus, and her, standing beneath the orange tree, smiling. Above us, in her uneven handwriting, she'd written, "My family, my home." I pulled her into my arms, feeling the small heartbeat that had given me strength through it all. "Do you remember when you were scared to tell the truth, sweetheart?" I asked. She nodded shyly. "And what did I tell you? That truth is the strongest thing we have." I smiled. "That's right, never forget it." She kissed my cheek. "I won't, Grandma, I promise." That evening, we had dinner on the porch. The sun melted into shades of gold and rose across the sky. Marcus grilled while Lily set out mismatched plates, insisting that it looks pretty that way. We laughed, the kind of laughter that comes only after tears. As we ate, I looked at them, my son, my granddaughter, and realized that what we'd built wasn't just survival. It was legacy. Thomas would have been proud. "Mom," Marcus said, looking out at the fading light, "you ever think about going back to law again?" I chuckled softly. "I think I already did." He laughed. "Yeah, you sure showed them." I reached over, squeezed his hand. "No, baby. We showed them that truth doesn't die, even when it's buried. It just waits for the right hearts to bring it back." Later that night, after the dishes were washed and Lily had fallen asleep under her blanket of stars, I sat on the porch alone. The briefcase, my old companion, rested beside me, empty now. Its purpose was done. The air was cool, laced with the smell of orange blossoms and rain. The sky stretched endlessly above, the same sky that had watched us through every loss, every victory. I thought about the courtroom, the faces, the fear, the faith. And then, softly, I whispered to the wind. That day, justice wasn't wearing a black robe, it wore the heart of a mother. I smiled, because I finally understood what that meant. Justice was never about punishment. It was about healing. And healing doesn't happen in courtrooms. It happens in kitchens, on porches, in the hearts of families that refuse to give up. The bells from the church downtown began to ring, the same ones that had tolled on the day of the trial. But this time, they sounded different. Not mournful, triumphant. Inside, Lily stirred in her sleep, whispering something about stars. Marcus's soft humming drifted from the living room, the tune his father used to sing. And for the first time in decades, I didn't feel haunted by the past. I felt held by it. As the last light faded, I whispered a prayer for all the mothers who fight in silence, for the children who grow through pain, and for every home learning to rebuild after the storm. Because no matter how dark the night gets, love always finds its way back to morning. To everyone who's listened to my story, thank you. Thank you for walking beside me through every heartbreak, every trial, every small victory that kept hope alive. Life isn't perfect, but it is precious, and the love of family is the one treasure no one can steal. Wherever you are, I hope you hold your loved ones a little closer tonight. May your home always be filled with laughter. May your heart always be guided by truth, and may peace find you even after the longest storm. With all my heart, Evelyn Walker. And to you, dear listener, thank you for being part of this journey. May you and your family be safe, healthy, and blessed.